The Polish 1968 political crisis, also known in Poland as March 1968 or March events, pertains to a major student and intellectual protest action against the government of the Polish People's Republic. The crisis resulted in the suppression of student strikes by security forces in all major academic centers across the country and the subsequent repression of the Polish dissident movement. It was also accompanied by a mass emigration following an anti-Semitic campaign waged by the Minister of Internal Affairs, General Mieczysław Mozar, with the approval of First Secretary Władysław Gomulka of the Polish United Workers' Party. The protests coincided with the events of the Prague Spring in neighboring Czechoslovakia, raising new hopes of democratic reforms among the intelligentsia. The unrest culminated in the Warsaw Pact invasion of Czechoslovakia on 20 August 1968. The government's anti-Jewish campaign had already begun in 1967. The policy was carried out in conjunction with the Soviet withdrawal of all diplomatic relations with Israel after the Six-Day War, but also involved a power struggle within the Polish Communist Party itself. The subsequent purges within the ruling party, led by Mieczysław Mozar and his faction, failed to topple Gomulka's government, but resulted in an expulsion from Poland of thousands of individuals of Jewish ancestry, including professionals, party officials and the secret police functionaries blamed for the crimes of the Stalinist period. In carefully staged public displays of support, factory workers across Poland were forced to publicly denounce Zionism. At least 13,000 Poles of Jewish origin emigrated in 1968–72 as a result of being fired from their positions and various other forms of harassment. Background: political turmoil of the late 1960s, exemplified in the West by the increasingly violent protests against the Vietnam War, were reflected in the East by the events of the Prague Spring, which began on 5 January 1968. A growing wave of protests in Czechoslovakia marked the high point of a broader series of dissident social mobilization. The protests within the framework of Kumkan had a partial precedent in the Polish 1956 worker protests and the Polish October events. Numerous instances of protest and revolt, especially among students, reverberated across the continent in 1968. A growing crisis of Communist Party control over universities, the literary community, and intellectuals more generally, marked the mid-1960s. In Poland, those persecuted for political activism on campus included Jacek Kuron, Adam Michnik, Karol Modzelewski, Barbara Torunszyk, and numerous others. Polish student and intellectual protest. Origin of popular unrest and theater event trigger. The outbreak of the March 1968 unrest was seemingly triggered by a series of events in Warsaw, but in reality it was a culmination of trends accumulating in Poland over the several preceding years. The economic situation kept deteriorating and a drastic increase in the prices of meat went into effect in 1967. In 1968, the market was destabilized further by the rumors of an upcoming currency exchange and the ensuing panic. Higher norms were enforced for industrial productivity with wages reduced at the same time. First Secretary Gomulka was afraid of all changes. The increasingly heavy censorship stifled intellectual life. The boredom of stagnation and the mood of hopelessness generated social conflict. The disparity between the expectations raised by the Polish October movement of 1956 and the actuality of the real socialism life of the 1960s led to mounting frustration. At the end of January 1968, after its poor reception at the Central Committee of the Communist Polish United Workers' Party, the government authorities banned the performance of a seminal romantic play by Adam Mickiewicz called Jadi, directed by Kazimierz Dymek at the National Theatre in Warsaw, on the grounds that it contained Russophobic and anti-Soviet references and represented an unduly pro-religion stance. The play had been staged 14 times, the last time on January 30. The ban was followed by a demonstration after the final performance, resulting in numerous police detentions. Dymek was expelled from the party and subsequently fired from the National Theatre. He left Poland and returned in 1973, to continue directing theatrical productions. In mid-February, a petition signed by 3,000 people protesting the censorship of Jadi was submitted to Parliament by the student protester Irina Lasota, gathered for an extraordinary meeting on February 29. The Warsaw chapter of the Polish Writers' Union condemned the ban and other encroachments on free speech rights. The speakers blamed the faction of Minister Mozar and the party in general for anti-Semitic incidents, as the shameful campaign was just gaining steam. On March 4, the removal of dissidents Adam Michnik and Henryk Szalajfa from the University of Warsaw was announced by the officials. A crowd of some 500 rallying students at the university on March 8 was met with the violent attack by the state-mobilized worker squad, as well as police in uniform. Nonetheless, other institutions of higher learning in Warsaw joined the protest a day later. ORMO and ZOMO attack and its consequences. Historian Dariusz Gawin of the Polish Academy of Sciences pointed out that the March 68 events have been mythologized in subsequent decades beyond their modest original aims. Under the lasting influence of the originally left-wing Komandosi, a student political activity group. During the 1968 crisis, the dissident academic circles produced very little in the area of written accounts or programs, mostly because of the moral shock of the lies spread by the government and the unexpectedly violent repressions. They also experienced an ideological shock, caused by the reaction of the authorities and society to their idealistic attempts to subject the People's Republic to revolutionary reform. The alienation of the reform movement from the ostensibly socialist system had begun. The students were naive in terms of practical politics, but their leaders professed strongly leftist convictions, expressed in brief proclamations distributed in 1968. Demanding respect for the ideals of the Marxist-Leninist dictatorship of the proletariat and principles of socialism. The students were singing the International Anthem, and then of the establishment of the new democratic liberal Poland would obliterate the socialist, leftist and revolutionary aspects of the March 1968 movement. Therefore, the storming of Warsaw University by the factory workers came as a total surprise to the students. The 1,000 participants of the 8th of March rally were met with violent beatings from ORMO Volunteer Reserve and ZOMO riot squads just as they were about to go home. The disproportionately brutal reaction of the security forces appeared to many observers to be a provocation perpetrated to aggravate the unrest and facilitate further rounds of repression. In the political leaders' self-interest, a demonstration of similar size originated on March 9 at the Warsaw Polytechnic and was also followed by confrontations with the police and arrests. Koron, Modzelewski and Michnik were imprisoned again, and a majority of the Komandosi members were detained. Within a few days, protests spread to Kraków, Lublin, Gliwice, Katowice, and Łódź, Wrocław, Gdansk, and Poznan. The frequent demonstrations at the above locations were brutally suppressed by the police. Mass student strikes took place in Wrocław on March 14–16, Kraków on March 14–20, and Opole. A student committee at Warsaw University and an inter-university committee in Kraków were formed. Attempts to organize were also made in Łódź and Wrocław. Efforts aimed at getting industrial workers involved, for example employees of the state enterprises in Gdansk, Wrocław and Krakow's Nowa Huta, produced no tangible effects. But on March 15 in Gdansk 20,000 students and workers marched and fought into the late evening the security forces of 3,700 men. The actual university students comprised less than 25% of those arrested for participation in the opposition activities in March and April, while the leading role in the countrywide street protests was played mainly by young factory workers helped by high school students. Repression's media campaign of besmirching the targeted groups and individuals was conducted from March 11. The Stalinist and Jewish roots of the supposed instigators were exposed, and most printed press participated in the propagation of slander, with the notable exceptions of Politika and Tygodnik Powszechny. Mass, spontaneous rallies at places of employment and in squares of major cities got going at the same time. The participants demanded that students resume their studies, writers their writing, Zionists go to Zion, or threatened, "We'll tear off the head of the anti-Polish Hydra." On March 14, the regional party secretary Edward Gierek in Katowice used surprisingly strong language while addressing the Upper Silesian crowds. "Make our peaceful Silesian water more turbid. Those Zambrowskis, Staszewskis, Slonimskis and the company of the Kisielewski and Jasionek are kind revisionists, Zionists, lackeys of imperialism. Silesian water will crush their bones." Gierek introduced there a new element, a statement of support for First Secretary Władysław Gomulka, who until then had been silent on the student protests, Zionism and other currently pressing issues. This initial puzzling reluctance of the top leadership to express their position ended with a hardline speech by Gomulka on March 19, which eliminated the possibility of government negotiations with the strikers, and, for many protest participants, extinguished the hope for a quick favorable settlement. Gomulka's speech, delivered before the 3,000 outstanding during the difficult days party activists gathered, was full of anti-intelligentsia accusations. The party management realized, he made it clear, that it was too early to fully comprehend and evaluate the nature and scope of the present difficulties. Gomulka sharply attacked the opposition leaders and named the few writers he particularly abhorred, but offered a complex and differentiated analysis of the situation in Poland. The first secretary attempted to pacify the growing anti-Semitic wave, asserting that most citizens of Jewish origin were loyal to Poland and were not a threat. Loyalty to Poland and socialism, not ethnicity, was the only criterion. The party valued highly those who had contributed and was opposed to any phenomena of anti-Semitic nature. It was understood that some people could be ambivalent about where they belonged and those who definitely felt more closely connected with Israel. Gomulka expected to eventually emigrate. It may have been too late for reasoned arguments of this kind, and the carefully screened audience did not react positively. Their collective display of hatred was shown on national television. Gomulka's remarks were criticized a few days later at the meeting of first secretaries of the provincial party committees, and the anti-Jewish campaign continued unabated. Also, the internal bulletin of Mieczysław Mozar's Ministry of Internal Affairs spoke of a lack of clear declaration on Zionism on Gomulka's part and of public hiding of criminals. Such instances of criticism of top leaders were unheard of and indicated the increasing influence and determination of Mozar's faction. Publicly, Mozar himself concentrated on condemning the communists who came after the war from the Soviet Union and persecuted Polish patriots. The purges and resolutions of the power struggle at the party's top circles entered their accelerated phase. The mass protest movement and the repressions continued throughout March and April. The revolt was met with dissolution of entire academic departments, expulsion of thousands of students and many sympathizing faculty members, arrests and court trials. National coordination by the students was attempted through a March 25 meeting in Wrocław. Most of its attendees were jailed by the end of April. On March 28, students at Warsaw University reacted to the firing of prominent faculty by adopting the Declaration of the Student Movement. which proposed a framework of mature systemic reforms for Poland, laying a conceptual foundation for the future nationwide opposition movement. The authorities responded by eliminating several university departments and enlisting many students in the military. The student protest activities planned for April 22 were prevented by the arrest campaign conducted in Warsaw, Kraków and Wrocław. At least 2,725 people were arrested just between March 7 and April 6. According to internal government reports, the suppression was generally effective, although students were able to disrupt the May Day ceremonies in Wrocław, except for the relatively few well-recognized protest leaders. The known participants of the 1968 revolt generally had not reappeared in the later waves of opposition movement in Poland. By mid-March the protest campaign spread to smaller towns. The distribution of flyers was reported in 100 towns in March, 40 in April, and, despite numerous arrests, continued even during the later months. Street demonstrations occurred in several localities in March. In different cities, the arrests and trials proceeded at different pace, in part because of the discretion exercised by the local authorities. Gdansk had by far the highest rate of both the penal administrative procedures, and the cases that actually went to the courts. The largest proportion of the arrested and detained nationwide during the March-April unrest belonged to the workers category. A few dared to openly defend the students, including some writers, bishops, and the small parliamentary ZNAK group of Catholic deputies, led by Jerzy Zawiecki. ZNAK submitted an official interpellation on March 11, questioning the brutal anti-student interventions by the police, inquiring about the government's intentions regarding the democratic demands of the students and their broad public opinion, and addressed to the Prime Minister. Following the April 8 Politburo meeting, during which Stefan Jedrzejowski strongly criticized the anti-Semitic campaign, but a majority of the participants expressed the opposite view or supported Gomulka's middle course. A same session indirectly dealt with the crisis on April 9/11. The Radio Free Europe used the ZNAK interpellation for its propaganda, asserted Prime Minister Joseph Cyrankiewicz. Other speakers claimed that the interpellation was primarily aimed at getting the hostile foreign interests involved in Poland's affairs. Zawiecki spoke in a conciliatory tone, directing his comments and appealing to Gomulka and Zenon Klisko, recognizing them as victims of past political persecution. He interpreted the recent beating by unknown assailants of Stefan Kisielewski, a Catholic publicist, as an attack on a representative of the Polish culture. The communist leaders terminated Zawiecki's membership in the Council of State, a collective head of state organ, and banned him from holding a political office in the future. The participants in the public Sejm debate concentrated on attacking ZNAK and avoided altogether relating to the events and issues of the march, protests, or their suppression. The effectiveness of the ORMO interventions on university campuses and the eruption of further citizen discontent prompted the Ministry of Public Security to engage in massive expansion of this force, which at its peak in 1979 reached over 450,000 members.